Hi, good morning. Welcome to the September edition of our Dynamics 365 community call. Welcome, everybody. This is Karen Moen. Great to have you here this morning. Just a couple logistics. This session is recorded, so if you don't want to be part of a recorded session, you can drop now. This recording will be available. Sorry about that. Just had to switch something off. This session will be available along with the slide deck. Afterwards, we'll post it to our Yammer group, and the recording will also be out on our YouTube channel. So today we're very excited to have Harold Horgan with us from the York Group. Harold and his team at the York Group had kind of been at the forefront of business model transformation for cloud and SaaS-based businesses, and have done a lot of work with Microsoft on partner profitability. So Harold's here today to talk about why and how to build repeatable IP into your business model, which is very important for all of our Dynamics partners. Today we plan, Harold has about 45 to 50 minutes of content, and then we'll have some time for Q&A afterwards. If you have questions, you can enter them into the message window, and again, we'll answer those at the end of the session. So without further delay, I'll hand it over to Harold. Harold, you have the floor.
Thanks, Karen. Yes, this is built on a presentation that I did at Inspire, and I've been going to WPC and Inspire for 12 years now and have breakout sessions every year. And this is the topic that generated the most follow-up conversations of any session that I've done in the past. So it's clearly a topic that the services partners in the Microsoft community and especially the Dynamics community are interested in. So the topic is why and how to build a repeatable IP business model. I'm going to spend just a few slides on the why part of it, because I think many of you get that already, but I'll be going into quite a bit of detail on the how. Just by way of background, the York Group has been working with business-to-business, so enterprise software companies, for about 25 years on their business models, their business strategies. For the last 6-7 years, as Karen mentioned, we've been working very closely with Microsoft around business model transformation for different types of partner groups. And these are some of the companies that we worked with. We worked with a lot of the global ISVs. We're working with a number of their nationally managed SIs and some of the mid-range SIs on the business model transformation as they build up an IP business, and that's what I'll be talking about today. And we're also working with a number of their global LSPC licensed solution partners as they transition from being reliant on high-volume license processing to working to more work with more, call them niche, vertical-focused ISVs. The first slide that I'm going to go through is probably the most important one, IKT. And what that stands for is, yeah, I know that. I'm going to be covering a lot of ground. Some of it is basic, so as you sit and listen to the slides, you will know some of the things that I talk about, but this is going to be an end-to-end presentation. I think that will fill in a lot of the missing bits for the ones that have some experience, and it will provide a nice roadmap for the companies that are just looking at whether or not they should be building out repeatable IP. So let's talk about why it makes sense for companies. It is really a way to increase revenues. If you can build repeatable IP and get that into a marketplace, get it into a channel or do some direct sales, it increases your revenues. The other thing is that IP generates much better margins than services businesses do. Services businesses will generate anywhere from, let's say, 10 to 15% margins if they're well managed, where the gross margin from IP, if it's a cloud-based solution, runs 70 to 75%. And I'll be talking about this in a little bit more detail. For most of you, you can actually build a repeatable IP business by leveraging your existing resources. There will be some investment required depending on how strategic and how important you want this to be, but you will be able to leverage a lot of the resources that you have. And at the end of the day, this combination of increased revenues, better margins, and building on your existing infrastructure allows you to increase the market value of your company. And for most business owners, that's the end game. That's the objective. And this is based on valuations. These are numbers from the US. And what we've seen is that a traditional services company is doing on-premise work and project-based business. When they are sold, they are typically sold for a multiple of between 4 and 7 times EBITDA. That's earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, essentially the cash flow of the company. Now, if that same services company provides the same services but under managed services contracts rather than project-based, the valuation bumps up to 8 to 10 times EBITDA because there's a lot more value put in for companies that have a repeatable business model with recurring revenues where they have the visibility around managed contracts. So investors like that. So there's a lot of roll-ups today around managed services companies because companies are buying those contracts and the ongoing annuity revenue stream. But when you look at IP, it's not related to cash flow or profitability. The valuation for IP is typically 4 to 10 times revenues, regardless of their level of profitability. So you can see that for companies that have the ability to build IP as an extension of their existing business, it's a great way to add value to the company. But we get a lot of pushback when we talk to companies because it's not that easy. I'm going to go through all the steps, and on paper it can look like it's a very easy transition, but it does require a lot of changes for an organization. And the pushback that we get from services companies are things like, well, the clients want to own the code, and in many cases they do. That's going to be part of the contract that you have, that they own the work product. So you have to negotiate something with them that it gives you the right to commercialize that IP. And whether that is a reduced price for the companies or some type of preferential treatment or revenue sharing royalty model with your client, you have to build in some type of commercial relationship that allows you to access that code. In many cases, when you're building custom IP, custom applications, it is very specific to that client, and there may not be a market for that code without having to re-engineer it quite a bit. And this is where the additional investment comes in. If you've built a lot of custom IP, you just can't take that custom IP, put it up in a marketplace, and expect people to buy it. You probably have to re-engineer the product so that it can be sold and installed on a repeatable basis. And then you have the ongoing investment in making sure that you're improving that product on an ongoing basis. And that's where product development becomes a little bit more difficult than custom IP development. And the biggest thing, the organizational impact, and I'll be talking about that quite extensively today. It is a different mentality, it's a different DNA, you're using different metrics, and in many cases you have to have different people on the team to drive the repeatable IP business. So as we look at companies and the maturity model for developing repeatable IP, it starts at the first level with non-packaged custom IP, and many of you are already doing that. You're going in and solving a very specific problem or an issue for your client, and you're developing that custom IP. And then you say, well, gee, maybe we can do this for 2 or 3 other clients with a lot of customization around it, but it becomes a little bit more repeatable, but you still haven't made a real investment in an ongoing scalable business model. And then the third step is when you've done that, you say, well, we now can make this IP repeatable. You've sold this to multiple clients. You're starting to make an investment in sales and marketing. And the big issue is now, how do you scale that business? And then the fourth phase in the maturity model is that a company is fully transformed. And typically at that level, they have a dedicated business unit dedicated to that product. It's very difficult to just bolt it onto the existing business and expect it to be successful. Or we've seen many companies, Nintex is a poster child for this, where they've moved away from the services business completely, sold off the services, and they've just become an IP company. So you as a services company already have a head start compared to most startups. When you think of the typical startup, the proverbial 2 guys and a dog in a garage, they have to go tin cupping to the VCs to raise very substantial funds, many cases 5, 10, 15, maybe $50 million to run their business. And many of the things that they need investment funding for are things that you already have. So you have product development. If you're developing custom IP, you know how to develop a product, even if it's very specific to a client. You have a marketing organization. You're getting the message out. You're selling your services through your sales team. So you have the sales organization. And then you have customer support to support the relationships that you've established with your customers. And the most important thing is that you do have those customers. You have an installed base. So if you look at the startup that I talked about, the 2 guys and a dog in the garage, they have none of these things. They have to build up all of these things, and that's where the $10 to $20 million comes in. So for you as an organization, it's a much easier extension. It's a much easier ramp up at a much lower capital investment than a startup would normally have. So the question is no longer, should you develop repeatable IP? The question is, why in the world wouldn't you build repeatable IP? And then I think many of you are still thinking, well, it's a distraction. We're a services company. Isn't this going to be a distraction from our core business? Well, I would say that most companies, if they're successful as a services company, are already IP companies. If you look at the different types of IP that you can develop, one of them is custom apps, and there's a fairly straight line progression from building a custom app to building repeatable applications because you already have the solution developed. But business processes are also IP. And many companies are taking those business processes and wrapping that into a solution and using that as the base for the repeatable IP business. And then the third level is domain expertise. And this is a longer road because very often that domain expertise could be deep vertical market expertise, could be very deep expertise around a specific area like security. A lot of times that sits in somebody's head and that has to be documented. And from that documentation, you then have to build out a solution. But as a services company, I would bet that just about all of you have some custom IP that you own in one of those three buckets. So what we've done with a number of companies as a first step is look at what you've already done over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years and review the projects and catalog that IP. Excuse me. And then catalog it in terms of how easy would it be to build that out. I was down in Australia a couple of years ago at the Australia Partner Conference for Microsoft. And I was doing a series of master classes for their services companies. And in just about every session that I did, companies sat and said, yeah, and a lot of them were Dynamics partners. Said, well, we've built 10, 15 custom apps for our clients. And then the process is to go through and prioritize based on how easy or difficult would it be to take a specific technology and make it repeatable and take it to market. The other thing that we've seen successful companies do is that they pick a vertical, and they do that for a number of reasons. One is that it makes it easier to sell when you speak the language of the customers. And when you look at your business, even if you see yourself as being horizontal, if you look at your customers and look at that bell curve of the distribution of customers, you're likely to find that there will be a critical mass of customers in specific verticals where you're doing quite well. So that would be a good starting point. And another way to pick a vertical is to talk to salespeople, especially salespeople that come from other companies, because they might be bringing with them very deep, very specific vertical market expertise. And the important thing is when you're selling a vertical market solution is that you have someone that speaks the language that can really identify and relate to the end users. And that's where the salespeople come in. They're so critically important. So I'm going to tell a little bit of a story here on why it's so important to be very focused on the market that you go after. And this story is called The Optimist, and it goes back to the Revolutionary War days in the United States. And there are two bounty hunters, Hank and Frank, and they're down on their luck. They're down to their last silver dollar. They ride into town, and they find a saloon. They're going to spend that last silver dollar. And while they're at the bar, they get into a conversation with the saloon owner. And when the saloon owner finds out that they're bounty hunters, says, wow, this is great. You guys are here at exactly the right time. Hank and Frank look at each other and say, well, why is that? And the owner says, well, just a couple of days ago, my brother was killed by some redcoats, and I am offering a $1,000 reward to anyone that can bring back a British soldier, dead or alive. Hank and Frank looked at each other and said, well, this is great. This is what we do. This is $1,000, and we really need the money. So they got on their horses, and they rode out of town. They found a poor victim, and they chased him down to the bottom of a ravine. And Frank had him on the ground, tying him up, getting ready to bring him into town, and he feels Hank pulling his sleeve. And Hank saying, stop, Frank, stop. Frank said, stop. What do you mean, stop? This is $1,000. We need the money. And Hank says, no, look, up. And up at the top of the ravine, there were thousands of redcoats getting ready to attack them. And Frank looked up at that, and his eyes got big, and he said, we're going to be millionaires. So the point of that story is that you have to pick your battles very carefully. You can't be everything to everybody. So let's look at the business model, compare the business model of what you're doing today and what it would look like as repeatable IP. And it's not that much different. So today you might be building custom applications and you're doing project work and you're getting paid for that. You will be paid for the implementation, which is the services project. And then in many cases, you will have a support and maintenance agreement for that application. Now, if we compare that with a cloud-based solution, repeatable IP, you will now be selling that on a subscription basis multiple times. Now, the value per subscription is going to be lower than what you got for building the custom app in the first place, but it's going to happen time and time again. And in most cases, repeatable IP will also require an implementation. And we've seen a lot of services companies develop repeatable IP simply to drive their services business. And that can be very profitable. And then instead of a support contract, because the support will normally be built into the subscription value, you're now getting renewals. But the renewals are on a year in, year out basis the same as the initial subscription. So if you're getting $10, $15, $20,000 or euros a year for subscription, you're getting that every year, as opposed to 10 or 15 or 20% of that as a services contract. So you can see that the basic business model isn't that much different. So this is a question that we've received from Microsoft and Microsoft partners. This goes back 6 or 7 years ago. And Microsoft said, your group, you're dealing with a lot of ISVs. You're seeing the business model transformation that they're going through. Is there a formula that we can provide to our partners? Can we reduce all of this to a simple, elegant, easy to remember formula? And we put a lot of effort into that, and we've come up with the formula on this next screen. And the formula is, there you go. And the point of this slide is that when there's uncertainty, when people don't really know what to do or what to expect, there's a perception of complexity, and people make things more complex than they need to be. And I think that's one of the blockers for companies in going into this business model, so they don't know what's involved. It's very uncertain, and they don't like the uncertainty. And from our perspective, every business model comes down to the same 3 principles. Every product, every service that's out there follows the same basic principles. Somebody makes something, somebody buys something, and somebody sells something. So you are the one that's going to make something. Someone who buys it is your target market. We'll go through all of these things in a little bit more detail. And then you have to take it to market. But whatever you do, it always comes down to these 3 business elements. So let's talk about this and the organizational change that's required. And this is where you have to make a very important decision. Is IP going to be opportunistic, or is it going to be strategic? And there's no wrong answer. It's just that you need to know what that answer is. If it's opportunistic, it's not going to have a big impact on your organization. You've already got some custom IP. You want to package that. You want to put it up on a marketplace. And we'll go through some of the ways that you can generate some revenues for opportunistic business model. But if it's strategic, it will have a big impact on you. It will change your cash flow, your marketing, your sales organization, your customer support. There will be a fundamental shift in your business model, and we'll cover that in detail as well. So let's look at the cash flow. What happens with cash flow is that this is a recurring revenue model, and you're front-ending a lot of the expenses in onboarding a new customer. And it's this customer acquisition cost that companies aren't always prepared for. And we see this a lot with startups. They underestimate what the customer acquisition costs actually are. They're only looking at it in terms of an email campaign or SEO or AdWords, very specific campaigns, but they're not adding in everything that goes into the cost of onboarding a customer. And so the formula for this is that the customer acquisition cost is a total cost, and that is your sales, your marketing, salaries, overhead, everything that it costs you to run your business divided by the total number of customers. And that's going to be a much bigger number than the number associated with a specific marketing initiative. Now, this is your cost. So this is an investment that you make upfront to bring on a customer, and you measure that against the lifetime value or the expected lifetime value of a relationship. So if you're spending $1 to bring on the customer, how much will that customer generate in revenues for the life of that relationship? And that can be very difficult to measure, because when you're starting out, you don't know whether your customers are going to stay with you for a year, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. So you just have to estimate. And what the VCs use, venture capitalists, their rule of thumb is that the customer acquisition costs need to be less than 1/3 of the lifetime value of that relationship. And the flip side of that, when they look at it, is that the customer acquisition costs need to be less than 12 months. So what they're using in an unproven product, in an unproven market, they're using an estimate of a 3-year life cycle, that the customer will stay on board for 3 years. And that you would need to be prepared to spend the first year of revenues or potential revenues to bring on board that customer. So this is a really an important part of the business because companies start making all these investments up front, and once you start making the investments, it's very difficult to stop. It can have a huge impact on your cash flow and the cash flow of your existing business if you're subsidizing the recurring revenue model from the new IP from your core business. And this is a bit of an eye chart, and you can look at this in more detail later. I just want to highlight a couple of things. So it really is, how do you reduce the cost to acquire a customer? How do you reduce that initial investment? And then once you've made that investment, how do you get as much money as possible from that relationship? How do you monetize that relationship? And there's some key elements in reducing the cost. And you'll see this, that most companies have a free trial. SaaS companies have a 15-day or 30-day free trial. It's a way of getting companies, prospective customers, to try out the product. And for enterprise solutions sold to enterprise customers, using channels, indirect channels, where you're offloading the sales and marketing costs to the channel partners. What drives the costs up, though, are field sales. Anytime you have an individual, a real-life person involved, it drives up the cost tremendously. And we'll come back to that on how you use automation to eliminate some of that. And a real killer, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail as well, is the churn rate. So churn rates are the customers that don't renew the license for whatever reason. And then the real key to long-term success is you're building up your recurring revenues. It's a building model. And then cross-selling, upselling, selling more to existing customers. So if you have a customer that's producing $1,000 a month, if you can sell them more users, more functionality, new features, cross-sell other solutions, then monetize that relationship, then it helps improve the return on the investment on that initial onboarding cost. So churn is the customers who stop paying. And it's the inverse of your renewal rate. So if 95% of your customers are renewing their contracts, that means that you have a 5% churn rate. And it can be measured against a lot of different metrics. The typical one is just the monthly recurring revenue, measuring what my monthly recurring revenues were in January versus February versus March, and whether or not some of that is disappearing. Bookings are the contract. So if you have someone that signs a 12-month contract at $1,000 a month, then the booking is $12,000. And if they don't renew, then it's a $12,000 booking loss. And then you can also look at it by count. This can be very useful if you have just a few large customers and lots of small customers. The small customers are companies that you want to increase the usage and grow them to be big customers. So if you're starting to see a lot of the small customers not renew, then that can be a real red flag, a real warning signal for you that something's wrong in your model, because that makes it possible or more likely that the big customers are also going to leave, which would really impact your revenues. Now, again, this is just for visibility, just to illustrative purposes, just to show you that when you have churn of 2.5 or 5%, the result, the impact over a 5-year period is very significant. If you have a 5% monthly churn, at the end of 5 years, the revenues that you have lost from customers who no longer are with you exceeds what you're actually getting in monthly revenue. So you're at the end of 5 years, you would be at 50% of what your revenue should be if you've been able to maintain a 0% churn rate. So it really has a very big impact on your long-term cash flow if your customers aren't renewing. The most significant causes of churn, why do people leave? The first is lack of perceived value gained from the application. They've tried the application, they've downloaded it, they paid for a few months, and they just don't use it, they don't feel the value, and they stop paying for it. The second most common reason is that they're not happy with you as a vendor. They had a technical issue, they logged in a phone call or an email or live chat, and they didn't get the response that they expected. The third most common reason is that they never used the full application. They didn't realize that there were 3 or 4 other modules, and this is why you see companies spend so much time and money with hunters and farmers, where the farmers are the ongoing account managers that are responsible for helping their clients check out all the different functionality. You'll see a lot of automation. So if you're using things like Zoho or a lot of HighJump, there are a lot of different applications that you may be subscribing to, and you'll see monthly emails coming in saying, have you tried this? Have you tried that? Are you looking at this functionality? Because they can actually measure and monitor your usage and see what you're using, what you're not using. And the fourth most common reason is simply that companies are cutting back on non-essential expenses, and there's nothing you can do about that. So reducing churn, because this is so important. How do you do that? again, hunters and farmers, having customer success managers, customer relationship managers, people that are on an ongoing basis communicating with your clients to make sure that they're happy with the application, that they're using more of it, that it's becoming part of their ongoing business process. Measure that customer engagement through the application. Build telemetry into the application that shows how much of the application is being used, how often it's being used, how many people are using it. That'll have an impact on your ability to go out and talk to your customers. And then find out what makes your product sticky. This is really one of the biggest values of building a cloud-based SaaS application, is that you can really monitor everything that's happening with your application. In an on-premise world, if you sell a 500 user license, your knowledge of what happens to that application stops at the door. You won't know whether there's 1 user, 5 users, 400 users, and which parts of your application are being used. But with SaaS, you can build the telemetry that actually measures all of that, and you can find out that, wow, 90% of our customers are using 10% of the functionality. That's really the core value of this business, and that's what we need to focus our marketing on, our value proposition, and probably our engineering. And then negative churn is selling more to your existing customers to offset the ones that don't renew. So if 5% of your customers don't renew, but you're selling 10% more to your existing customers, you're actually offsetting the loss of revenues from that churn rate. So there's a carrot and a stick, and we see companies that do this, is you make it difficult for companies to leave. So you have them sign longer term contracts, and in the enterprise space this is very common. 1 year, 3 year, 5 year contracts. You can lock them in, where you make it very difficult for them to move their data from your application and export that easily into somebody else's application. And then for lower end applications, requiring a phone call. People do not like to make phone calls to cancel a $10 or $20 or $30 subscription. It makes them very angry that they're still stuck with this application, but they don't like the confrontational aspect of having to call somebody to unsubscribe. So all of this puts a new perspective on customer support. In a typical on-premises world, the support function is looked at as a cost center or as a profit center, where you provide the minimum level of support that's acceptable to your customer so that you can maximize the margins that you get from those ongoing support contracts. But in a cloud environment, a subscription model, the CLV as a customer lifetime value is really tied to the support that they get. And what we see with almost all of the major SaaS companies is that they're running their support function at zero profitability. So if they're getting the equivalent of 20% for support, they're spending 20% on support because the support function has become such an important part of the ongoing sales cycle. So this produces the cash flow chasm. The fact that you're making that investment up front in the customer acquisition cost, and then you're getting the lifetime value over time, produces this cash flow chasm. And there's a model worked out based on a single salesperson. This is from David Scott. He's a big VC in the Boston area for Matrix Partners, and they've made over 200 investments in SaaS companies. And what they show is, in this model, a salesperson is responsible for bringing in $5,000 every month in new monthly recurring revenues, and it takes 3 or 4 months for them to get on board to get to be 100%. But they will be costing the organization some form of salary, overhead, marketing, all of the costs associated with that salesperson while they're building up the recurring revenues before they reach their break even. And in a typical model, it takes 11 months for a salesperson to be bringing in recurring revenue that exceeds the total cost of that salesperson to the organization. And over time, now, so every month that they're bringing in revenues that are less than their total cost to the organization, they're losing money. So you can say that there's an aggregated loss that builds up over time. If you look at them as a profit center, they're building up a loss until they reach that break-even point. And under this model, it takes 23 months to get that investment back. But the good news is that once that investment is back, it's a great return on investment because now you're now making clear margins on those revenues. So it's really important to shorten that cycle of the losses. And the way companies are doing that to eliminate that cash flow chasm is to charge 1 year in advance. Let me just go back on that. And what you can see here is on the left-hand side, the comparison in the model where when in the green you can see when they charge a year in advance, it almost eliminates the cash flow chasm, and certainly over a longer period of time as well. And when you're selling into businesses, there's no need to be selling on a monthly or quarterly basis. corporations, large companies, prefer to pay once a month rather than having to set up a monthly payment scheme. So having an annual payment and 3-year contracts for a business solution, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's what every SaaS company should be doing to eliminate the impact on their cash flow. So let's take a quick look at pricing. And I'm just going to go through very quickly the pricing models, not in detail, but just to show you the range of pricing models that are available. And in the SaaS environment, it's a little bit of the Wild West because there's so many different ways to price the solution. In on-premise, it's typically a server-based license and some per-user licenses, or it's a perpetual license up front for an enterprise. And when we get into SaaS, we have free usage. So freemium, we see a lot of that. Freemium is like OneDrive, where you get a basic version of the product free, and then they're selling a professional version to get you to upgrade. Ad-based revenues, that's the Google and the Facebook model, where you get to use their application free forever, but they make their money on advertisements through their website. And related services, a lot of gaming applications are like where you get a basic game for free, and then you add additional functionality that you're paying for. And then we have a lot of metric-based pricing. This is the consumption usage-based pricing that is starting to, I think, become a more important factor in pricing. So the per meter storage is a typical example of that. You pay for the amount of storage that you're using. Per transaction, we have a couple of clients that were in invoice processing, online invoice processing, and so they just charge by the number of invoices that went through their system on a weekly or a monthly basis. And in mobility, we're seeing pricing move from per user to per device because so many people have 2 or 3 devices. It's a way of building more revenues per user instead of just saying, well, it's $10 per user. You can say, well, it's $5 per device, knowing that most users are going to have at least 2 devices. And then the by payment type, the monthly subscription, that's the classic. It's the per user per month. Revenue sharing, a lot of marketplace parallels, Odin, those types of applications will take a share of revenues. If it's a large enough customer, they won't charge anything upfront for the software itself. They'll do it all on a rev share. Or what they'll do in billing systems like Matanga and Zawara, what they will do is they'll have a base price, and then they'll have a percentage of the revenues that flow through their billing system. And then the last one, the bottom right, the license fee. There's nothing wrong with having a perpetual license, even though it's a SaaS-based application. And we see a lot of companies do this. And it overcomes a big issue with enterprise companies that would rather just buy it and amortize it on their balance sheet rather than pay on a monthly basis. So there's nothing wrong with having a perpetual license as long as you're charging an additional line item for the consumption or the usage, the hosting costs for the application. So that's what the typical pricing conversion, and what we're looking at here is when we look at an on-premise application, what's a typical conversion if a company says, well, we're selling this for $100,000 per year, what's the monthly or annual subscription value going to be? And the rule of thumb here is the rule of threes. You take the on-premise license, you add 3 years of maintenance, divide that by 3, and that produces a yearly or a monthly subscription price. Now, if you're not selling perpetual on-premise licenses today, where this becomes relevant is that the application that you want to take to market as a subscription-based model, look at what other software selling that have similar functionality but are being sold as on-premise. And if you can, so if let's say you're doing something around business process reengineering or HR, whatever it happens to be, and you want to release this and sell this as a monthly subscription, look for comparable solutions that are sold on-premise, see what their prices are, and then you'll have a baseline for figuring out what your monthly subscription should be. Because this comes back to it's a lease versus buy decision for the end user. If you have a 3-year payback, then the CFO is going to look and say, well, why don't we just pay for it and not have to pay for 10 years on a subscription? What's the break even going to be for the customer? And very difficult to win the TCO argument. What SaaS companies typically do, they say, well, it's going to be easier to deploy. You can reduce your personnel costs, shorter upgrade cycles. There's some scalability. But still, the CFO is going to look and say, well, if there's a 3-year payback, why don't we just pay for it, amortize it, pay for the maintenance? It's going to be a lot cheaper for us long term. So there needs to be a compelling economic reason to buy a SaaS solution. If it's the same functionality that's available in the cloud and on-premise, you will almost never win the total cost of ownership argument with a customer. So you have to look at what are the things that drive SaaS applications? What are the things that drive enterprise customers to buy a cloud solution? And there are a few buckets of those. One is that they've made the decision to start decommissioning their data center. So they have this massive data center. Every year, 20% of it comes up for a refresh cycle. And say, well, instead of refreshing that 20%, maybe a $5 million investment in servers and hardware, let's start moving non-essential workloads into the cloud. So it's a gradual decommissioning, but they're still going to maintain a core data center on site to run their mission critical applications. The second is companies that have made a financial decision that they don't want to be a data center company. They want to move everything off the balance sheet, and they want to run everything through operating expenses rather than capital expenses. Now, the bigger drivers, though, so the first two are really financial decisions. The third, though, is unique functionality, functionality that is only available because of the cloud. So mobility, collaboration, those types of things, building those into the application where the customer can't replicate that functionality on-prem. That drives them to buy a cloud solution. And then scalability. If there is variability in usage, so industries that have variable seasonal cycles like retail, where they run a lot of their compute cycles at the end of the year, or regulated industries that have to provide quarterly reports that have a huge use of compute cycles at the end of each quarter, at the end of each year. Many times they're looking at opportunities to scale down their data center and will move those workloads into the cloud. So what we found is that there's very little cannibalization. Enterprise customers that buy a cloud solution for a very specific reason and usually falls into one of those buckets. So let's move on to marketing. I'm not going to go into a lot of slides on marketing because Microsoft has a ton of content and on the YouTube channel, on Channel 9, there's all kinds of content around marketing. So I just want to hit some of the key points. And the first is that when you have a solution, building your value proposition, and this can be a very comprehensive, arduous task. And when we talk to marketing agencies, what they want to do is they want to put their clients through this type of a process that can take weeks or months and become, in many cases, they're charging hundreds of thousands of dollars to put them through this process. And when you're getting started, you don't want to spend $50,000 or $100,000 on the business on the value proposition. So I'm going to walk you through a very simple formula for doing it. So it's a FAB model. You start out by looking at what are the features of the product that you want to sell. What does it actually do? And then the second part of it is the application is how is the customer applying those features, that functionality? How is it being used? And from that, you define what the benefits are. How does the customer benefit from how they're using that particular functionality? And it's the benefits part of it that's the most difficult to define, and that's where the marketing agencies make their money. So here's a very simple way of doing that. If you look at this matrix, look at for every functionality, every feature, so take the top 3 or 4 features that you have in your product. And for each of those features, look at the customer and look at if they buy your product, what will happen to their organization? And if they buy their product, what doesn't happen? So what are the benefits in the what happens? What are the good things that happen? And then what doesn't happen? What are the bad things that go away if they buy your product? And then you look at the flip side and say, well, if they don't buy your product, what will happen? And these will be the flip side of the same arguments. But as you do this, you'll look at the solution from the customer's perspective, how it impacts their organization. And from that, from each of the top 3, 4, or 5 features and functionalities, you will be able to define what the benefits are, what the business outcomes are for the customer. And you can do this in a couple of hours. It's a very simple process to go through. So the key in the marketing is that marketing is taking over a bigger and bigger role in the sales process, and that comes back to automation and driving down the customer acquisition cost. So if we look at the typical marketing for on-premise software, marketing generates the leads. They flip those leads over to the sales organization. The sales organization takes over the sales process, closes the deal. In SaaS solution, marketing is taking over the front end of that sales process. So you see a lot more self-service sales tools on the website. Marketing goes into the qualification process, they go into the testing, and salespeople, if needed, come in much later in the sales process. And this is done to drive down the customer acquisition cost, but it's also being done because SaaS customers tend to be much more self-service. They want to do their own research before they contact and speak to a vendor. So it's all about automating the entire client relationship. So the customer acquisition using SEO, paid search, email marketing, social media, content marketing, all those things to drive down the cost. And then using sales automation tools to convert that lead into a sale. And then how do you retain them on an ongoing basis, also using automation? So the point here is that every step in the client relationship, from the initial lead generation all the way through to customer support, should be automated as much as possible to reduce human intervention and human touch and to reduce your costs. Now let's look at sales, because this is an important aspect for companies. If it's opportunistic, if you're saying, well, we've got this cool little IP, we've packaged it enough for people to be able to buy it, but we don't want to make the investment in reorganizing our company, making an investment in hiring new people, setting up a different business organization. We want to do this on an opportunistic basis. Well, then you use marketplaces. And by all means, use AppSource. AppSource is going to be the primary platform for Microsoft to market Microsoft technologies and technologies built on Microsoft platforms. Huge amount of resources going into that. There's a qualification process that you have to go through, but it's worth it. And then you are on the marketplace, and it makes it much easier for people to find you. It makes it easier for the Microsoft field to find a solution that fits the requirements, especially as Microsoft now moves towards the solution maps and the industry solutions. They will be actively looking for applications that will meet those requirements. And then OEM, original equipment manufacturing, bundling, white label agreements, also a great way. If you want to remain a technology company and not become a commercial company, a sales and marketing driven organization, then find other software companies that are in a related space where your module, your technology could be a good fit, where that partner, that OEM partner, will now sell your module as part of their own solution or as an upsell to their existing customers, and then you collect a royalty on the relationship. Another thing is just use inside sales. You're going to be doing some type of lead generation, whether through AppSource or some basic marketing. There will be leads and inquiries coming in, but it's not going to be a huge flood. So have somebody inside in the organization, an existing resource, somebody that understands the product, somebody that's good with people on the phone, that you designate saying, well, when that call comes in, if it's 3 or 4 a week, that person is responsible for dealing with those prospects. Again, it's an inexpensive way of having a basic sales infrastructure in place. Now, if it's strategic, though, if this is really important to you, it does change your sales organization. And the first question that we get is, can we use our existing salespeople to sell this SaaS application, this IP? And the short answer is no. Very difficult, different DNA. In some cases, you don't have a choice. But the reason it doesn't work out is because selling a subscription model IP doesn't fit with what the salesperson wanted to do. The salesperson wants to get paid for closing a deal, and they want to get the commission now. Whether they've sold a project or they've sold an on-premise license, they want the thrill of the kill, close the deal, and get their commission. From a salesperson's perspective, if they have a choice of selling a cloud-based application on a subscription basis or selling a project or an on-premise solution with a payment upfront, they are always going to go with the on-premise or the upfront payment. They're commission-driven. This is one of the reasons companies very often, when they move into SaaS and as this becomes strategic over time, they build up a team of hunters and farmers. The hunters are the ones that close the deal. Then they throw the deal over the wall to the farmers. The partners are the customer success managers that are responsible for getting the upsells and the renewals. And I'll walk you through a basic, very, very basic compensation model for a pure SaaS model where you have hunters and farmers. And it's usually based on the monthly recurring revenues or the annual contract value. So the monthly recurring is you're charging $1,000 a month. That's monthly recurring. The annual contract value of that would be $12,000. And in a typical SaaS company, the hunter gets the first month's subscription as their commission. And I'll walk you through a numerical example of this in the next slide. The farmer gets some compensation, some incentive to upsell more stuff to existing customers. So if it's a straight renewal, they would get a commission that's equal to 20% of the hunting commission, not 20% of the subscription, but 20% of what the hunter received for bringing the subscription on board. And then they get a 40% of that hunting commission for upsells. And again, I'll just walk you through a quick model on that. So let's say the subscription price is $1,000 per month. The commission goes to the hunter of $1,000. The farmer comes in, and if the farmer just does their job, they get the renewal at $1,000 a month. They get a commission of $200 on the anniversary date of that subscription. But if they've done a really good job and they've doubled the usage, so it's now a $2,000 subscription, they would get an additional $400 on that extra $1,000 of usage. They get $600. Next year, if it's a $2,000 subscription and they just renew, then they would get $400 for that renewal. I know I'm going through this at a fairly quick pace, so please take advantage of the fact that you will have the slide deck available and this is being recorded so you can go back through it. But for you as a services company, the solutions, the subscription, the IP is only one slice of the pie. So you have to have probably a mixed or a blended compensation model based on what you want the people to do. So do you want them to sell professional services? Are you using the IP as a way to get more professional services from those customers? In which case you will probably have a gross margin component in the compensation model. If you want this to be a real growth model, then you could compensate your people for the number of customers. And we're seeing this in VC-funded companies, that more and more salespeople are getting compensated for the number of net new logos, not the exact revenues. So someone that brings in 10 subscribers at $1,000 a month gets a bigger commission than someone that brings in one customer at $10,000 a month, because each one of those $10,000 subscriptions can grow into something bigger. And at the end of the day, if you want to drive economic value from the IP business, there needs to be a revenue component to drive that top line revenue. So the last part of this presentation will talk about customer support. And again, it depends on whether this is going to be opportunistic or strategic. If it's opportunistic, there are low-cost ways of providing customer support. So online, you can have an FAQ database, so frequently asked questions with answers. If you want to spend a little bit more time and resources, you build out a knowledge base, which is searchable, incorporates documentation from different sources. It can be from other vendors, it can come from you, from customers, where you populate the knowledge base with indexed content that will help a customer solve their problems themselves. And then again, using an existing resource, live chat is like $29 per user per month, and where you designate one of your sales engineers or technical support people to be that support person whenever a call comes in. Again, if you're doing this on an opportunistic basis, you're not going to be flooded with calls. If it is strategic, though, it becomes much more comprehensive. As your customer base grows, very often you see companies move into community portals. If it's a more complex solution and you have to provide telephone support, you decide, are you going to have different classes of support? Is there a basic support model that is incorporated in the subscription? Do you have a pro version? Do you have a silver, gold, platinum? Do you tier the support based on response time and the level of people that are involved? In a SaaS application, we're seeing a lot of companies build support into the product to eliminate downstream calls. So they build analytics into it. They have contextual help, content sensitive help in the application. And then at the end of the day, you want your customer support to meet the SLA that you have. You have a services level agreement because you're provisioning a service to your customer, and you want to make sure that whatever support infrastructure you put in place helps you meet the basic requirements of that SLA. So let's summarize in this. If this is going to be opportunistic for you as an organization, it doesn't have that big of an impact. You can build the IP, you can put it up in a marketplace, you can do some basic SEO, AdWords, some basic marketing. You can use an inside salesperson and an inside resource to do the customer support. Not a big deal, and nothing wrong with doing this. Just make sure that you understand that you are doing this on an opportunistic basis. If it's strategic, though, it does change so many things in the organization. And that's why we see over time most successful companies splitting out the IP business as a separate business group or as a separate company. So you'll find this in the deck. There's a checklist that goes through, and make the decision. Do you want this to be opportunistic? And what are the things that you need to think about? Do you want this to be strategic? And then what are the things that you need to go into more detail on? Again, neither decision is wrong. Just make sure you make the decision. Where you get into trouble is where you think this is going to be strategic and you start making an investment without having thought through what it takes. So our suggestion is that when you go through this process, think about it as, what would it look like if it's strategic? Model an entire business model out as if it were going to be strategic, and then you can decide whether or not you're prepared to make that investment, those changes to your organization. If not, go back to being opportunistic. At some point, if the opportunistic strategy works and you start building up your sales, you'll be able to flip into a strategic business model, but then you'll know exactly where you're headed. So no matter what you do on paper, it's not always going to be the same. And one of my favorite sayings is, in theory, theory is reality. In reality, it isn't. Be prepared to adjust and adapt as you execute on your business model. And that takes us 1 minute over time. But now, Karen, I'll turn it back over to you, and let me know if there are any questions that came up. By the way, on our website, we've got a ton of resources. We've got short-form videos that cover every topic that I've gone through. We have an ebook, 101 questions about your SaaS business model, that goes, 60 pages of content that goes through kind of every aspect from A to Z in your SaaS business model. So I would encourage you to visit the website and download some of this stuff.
Great. Thank you so much, Harold. What just tons and tons of great information. And again, for everybody out there, we'll post the deck to our Yammer group, and the recording will also be available, as you mentioned, Harold, to kind of, I'm sure folks will have to look at this a couple times to absorb it, because there's a lot there. I don't have any open questions right now, so I think a lot of folks were just listening very intently, and again, really appreciate you sharing all this great information with us today.
Okay, Karen, my pleasure. And if anybody wants to contact me and they want a 1 hour follow-up, very happy to do that. I've done that with a lot of the attendees at Inspire. And I've also been asked to make presentations to a broader management team, where the people that attended at Inspire really liked it, but they wanted to get their management team involved. And I'm very happy to go through this. We'll probably schedule a little bit longer time so I can slow down the delivery, but very happy to do that as well.
Okay, great. And just to let you know, just a number of thank yous coming through from the folks that were on listening. So, great stuff. Well, thanks everybody for joining, and thanks again, Harold. We'll talk to you next month.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody.